Hello, everyone. We all know Christopher Columbus, the intrepid explorer, the man whose name is synonymous with the discovery of a new world, forever etched into the annals of history as a titan of navigation. But what if I told you that the legendary figure we celebrate, the one whose name sparks tales of grand adventure and heroic feats, died not with a sense of triumph, but with a crushing weight of failure, a failure so profound it shadowed his last breath, eclipsing even the world, altering impact of his voyages. This isn't the story of a hero basking in glory, but of a man consumed by an impossible dream, haunted by ghosts, and ultimately by the bitter taste of his own unfulfilled destiny. This is the tragic, untold saga of why Christopher Columbus, the man who connected two worlds, believed himself a colossal failure until his dying day from the humble. Sun-drenched docks of Genoa, a young soul stirred with an ambition as vast and untamed as the ocean itself. Cristoforo Colombo, as he was then known, was born into a world where the known earth abruptly ended at the horizon, where maps were incomplete prayers, and where the East, a realm of fabled riches and exotic spices, lay tantalizingly beyond a land route controlled by hostile empires. He wasn't born noble, or even particularly wealthy, but he possessed something far rarer, an unshakable conviction, a fire in his belly that whispered of greatness, of a destiny intertwined with the very fabric of the sea. Early years saw him as a modest sailor, a cartographer, a merchant. He sailed the Mediterranean, the Atlantic, learning the moods of the ocean, the whispers of the wind. Every voyage, every charted wave, fed a burgeoning, audacious idea in his mind. What if the world wasn't as vast as everyone believed? What if the East could be reached by sailing west? It was a heresy to many, a dangerous folly. But to Columbus, it was a divine inspiration, a revelation. His grand design wasn't merely a navigational theory. It was a crusade. He meticulously studied ancient texts, consulted astronomers, and perhaps most crucially, stretched calculations to fit his vision, shrinking the circumference of the Earth to make his westward journey feasible. This wasn't merely ambition. It was an obsession, a messianic certainty that God had chosen him for this monumental task. He saw himself as a latter-day prophet, a harbinger of a new era destined to open a path to the fabled Indies, not just for trade, but to fund a holy war, to reclaim Jerusalem. He would bring back enough gold to finance a new crusade, a noble enterprise that would secure his place in the heavenly annals as well as the earthly ones. But the path to destiny is rarely smooth. For nearly a decade, Columbus became a relentless petitioner, a persistent shadow haunting the opulent courts of Europe. He presented his daring proposal to the monarchs of Portugal, France, England, and Spain. Imagine him, a man of modest means, standing before kings and queens, their learned advisers, their skeptical cartographers. He spoke of untold riches, of new trade routes, and he was met, time and again, with dismissal, with polite incredulity, sometimes with outright ridicule. Portugal's King John II rejected him after his own experts deemed Columbus's calculations wildly inaccurate. The French and English courts were too preoccupied with their own conflicts. Back in Spain, Isabella and Ferdinand, caught in the throes of the Reconquista, had little patience for a foreign dreamer with an outlandish plan. Years bled into years, his clothes grew threadbare, his pleas more desperate, his self-belief more hardened, more resolute. He was a man possessed, a solitary figure against a tide of skepticism. His family faced poverty, yet he never wavered. This period of relentless rejection, of facing down the world's most powerful minds, and still clinging to his audacious vision, forged in him an iron will, but it also planted the seeds of a deep-seated paranoia, a bitter resentment against those who doubted him. He became convinced that the world was arrayed against him, a theme that would echo through the darkest chapters of his life. In 1492, with the fall of Granada, the last Moorish stronghold in Spain, Ferdinand and Isabella, flush with victory, finally turned their gaze back to the persistent Genoese. Perhaps it was a gamble, a last-ditch effort, or maybe Isabella, a devout Catholic, was swayed by Columbus's fervent religious rhetoric. They agreed to fund his expedition, granting him extraordinary titles: Admiral of the Ocean Sea, Viceroy, and Governor of any lands he might discover. He was to receive 10% of all revenues from these new territories. It was an unprecedented agreement, a testament to his sheer force of will, but also a dangerous precedent for a man with a messianic complex and a history of being spurned. On the 3rd of August, 1492, 3 small ships, the Santa Marfea, the Pinta, and the Naifea, set sail from Pala, Spain, into the vast uncharted Atlantic. For Columbus, this was more than a voyage. It was a vindication, a divine quest, finally set in motion. The journey was a crucible. Weeks turned into months. The crew, hardened sailors though they were, grew restless. Their fears mounting with every day the familiar European coast receded. Mutiny simmered beneath the deckboards, a constant threat. Whispers of monsters of the edge of the world filled the long, star-drenched nights. Columbus, ever the master of persuasion and stern resolve, quelled the unrest, promising land, promising riches, and then, on the 12th of October, 1492, a cry ripped through the pre-dawn darkness. "Tierra, tierra, land!" It was a moment of sheer, unadulterated triumph. The weary sailors wept, embraced their terror, replaced by ecstatic relief. Columbus, clad in his finest attire, knelt on the white sands of an island he named San Salvador, claiming it for Spain, planting the cross. He believed he had reached the outermost islands of the Indies, the gateway to Asia. He was a hero. He was proven right. The world would never be the same. But the seeds of his eventual downfall, the bitter harvest of his hubris, and the dark currents of human... He encountered the Taofeño people, a gentle, welcoming folk, adorned with small pieces of gold. Columbus's initial descriptions were full of wonder. They are very well built, with very handsome bodies and very good faces. They are a people of love and without covetousness. But beneath this veneer of admiration, his primary objective, the driving force behind his decade of struggle, quickly asserted. "I was attentive and labored to ascertain if there was gold," he wrote. That gold, those shimmering specks worn by the Taofeño, became a siren song, luring him further into a tragic destiny. He saw not a people, but a resource, not a culture, but a means to an end. His holy mission to fund a crusade quickly transmuted into a frantic, unholy scramble for wealth. He sailed among the islands, mesmerized by their beauty, but his gaze was always fixed on the promise of gold. He explored Cuba, which he mistakenly believed to be mainland China, and Hispaniola, an island teeming with natural beauty and, crucially, signs of gold. On Hispaniola he established the first European settlement in the Americas, La Navidad, leaving behind 39 men. He returned to Spain a conqueror, bringing with him not only tales of a new world, but also exotic plants, never before seen animals, and several Taofeño captives dressed in their native finery as living proof of his grand achievement. The reception was tumultuous. Parades, honors, the awe of the court. He was elevated to a position almost mythical. But the reality he left behind, his second voyage, launched in 1493, was a stark contrast to the first. It was no longer a small exploratory mission, but a massive armada, 17 ships, 1,200 men, soldiers, priests, farmers, adventurers, all eager to claim their share of the promised riches. This was the birth of a colonial enterprise, and with it, the beginning of the end for Columbus's idealized vision. The fort was burned, his men massacred. The Taofeño, pushed to their breaking point by the Europeans' greed, cruelty, and demands, had retaliated. It was a crushing blow, a stark reminder that this paradise was not his to simply claim. It was a brutal awakening, but not one that truly altered his course. Instead, he established a new settlement, Isabella, a city built. The promised gold was not flowing as freely as anticipated. The colonists, a mix of ambitious gentry and desperate commoners, found the reality of the New World far harsher than the dreams spun in Spain. They faced disease, famine, and the relentless, suffocating heat. Their greed, however, remained insatiable. They saw the Tafeno not as people, but as obstacles, or worse, as tools. The atrocities began almost immediately: forced labor, rape, murder, the systematic enslavement of the indigenous population. Columbus, caught between the demands of the crown for gold and the unruly, violent nature of his own men, struggled to maintain order. His attempts were often brutal, employing harsh punishments, including public floggings and executions against both colonists. He instituted the repartimiento system, a precursor to the notorious encomienda, forcing the Tafeno to collect a quota of gold. Failure meant severe punishment, often death. Those who resisted were hunted down with dogs. The once welcoming Tafeno people suffering under forced labor, European diseases to which they had no immunity, and systematic violence, so the paradise Columbus had envisioned had become a living hell, a kingdom of shadows where gold was extracted at the cost of human lives and souls. His letters back to Spain, however, painted a different picture, exaggerated promises of boundless gold and spices, masking the growing chaos, the discontent among the colonists, and the horrific cost to the native inhabitants. He portrayed himself as a righteous governor battling rebellion, both native and European, desperate to justify the enormous expense of his venture. Columbus himself remained largely convinced of his divine mission, and deeply, tragically deluded about his geography. He continued to search for the elusive continent, convinced he was near the earthly paradise, near the Asian mainland. He explored further south, encountering the mainland of South America on his third voyage, yet still convinced it was a vast unknown part of Asia. His geographic delusions deepened, becoming interwoven with mystical visions. He saw himself as a chosen instrument, a divine pathfinder, even as the realities of his administration crumbled around him. The failure to find the immense quantities of gold, spices, and silk he had so lavishly promised led to increasing debt and discontent back in Spain. The crown, having invested heavily, was growing impatient, hearing increasingly disturbing reports of tyranny, mismanagement, and brutality from the new colonies. The rumors, once whispers, grew into a deafening roar that reached the royal court. Accusations against Columbus and his brothers, fey of tyranny, injustice, and arbitrary cruelty, piled up. The crown, alarmed by the escalating chaos and the diminishing returns, decided it was time to act. In 1500, Francisco de Bobadilla, a royal commissioner, was dispatched to Hispaniola with sweeping powers to investigate. His arrival marked the beginning of Bobadilla wasted no time. He found a colony in disarray, rife with factionalism, violence, and rampant abuse of power. The evidence against Columbus was overwhelming. In a swift, decisive act that stripped the once mighty admiral of all his authority, Bobadilla arrested Christopher Columbus and his two brothers, Bartolomeo and Diego. Imagine the scene: the man who had opened up a new world, the viceroy, the governor, now shackled, paraded through the streets of Isabella, then loaded onto a ship, bound for Spain in chains. The humiliation was absolute, profound. He was stripped of his titles, his authority, his dignity. It was a stark, brutal contrast to the triumphant return he had made just a few years prior. A hero. Now he was a prisoner, an alleged tyrant, facing the wrath of the very monarchs he had served. The journey back was a torment. Columbus refused to let his chains be removed, insisting that he would wear them as a badge of honor, a symbol of the injustice he suffered, until the Queen herself released him. In Spain he was indeed released, and the monarchs, perhaps still valuing his initial contributions, restored some of his wealth and offered vague promises. But they never reinstated him to his full viceregal authority. The bitter taste of ingratitude, of betrayal, and of the irreversible loss of the power he believed was his by divine right, clung to him like a shroud. He would spend the rest of his life battling in court, fighting to reclaim what he felt was stolen from him, convinced that he was the victim of a cruel twist of fate, rather than the architect of his own downfall. Yet the ocean still called to him, a relentless mistress that refused to release her hold. Despite his disgrace, Columbus, ever the visionary, ever the desperate dreamer, convinced. His fourth journey commenced in 1502, was a final frantic effort to achieve his original unfulfilled goal to find the strait to the Indian Ocean, the passage that would definitively prove he had reached Asia, that would validate his grand design. He was an aging man, frail, tormented by gout and the psychological scars of his previous failures, but the fire of obsession still burned within him. This voyage was a harrowing saga of storms, shipwrecks, and mutiny. His small fleet was battered by relentless hurricanes, his ships reduced to rotting hulks. He explored the coast of Central America, convinced he was near the fabled lands of Marco Polo, just a narrow passage away from the riches of the Orient. He found no strait, only impenetrable jungles, hostile native tribes, and the growing despair of his crew. He was stranded for a year in Jamaica, his ship's worm, eaten and useless, facing starvation, mutiny, and disease. It was a period of extreme isolation, of paranoia, and of deepening religious fervor. He experienced increasingly vivid religious visions, believing himself an instrument of God, destined to find the Holy Land and immense wealth for a new crusade, even as his physical world crumbled around him. These visions fueled his delusion that he was still on the right path, despite all evidence to the contrary, despite the mounting pile of failures. He clung to the belief that he had discovered the earthly paradise, a land of biblical purity, and that the riches he sought were not for personal gain but for a higher, divine purpose. Yet, the true Asian mainland, the spices, the silks, the grand cities Marco Polo described, remained tantalizingly out of reach. He had come so close, yet still so far from his initial self-imposed definition of the ultimate failure to find the strait. The definitive passage to the Orient, slowly, agonizingly, dawned upon him. His final return to Spain, in 1504, was not that of a triumphant admiral, but a broken, defeated man, his body racked by illness, his spirit consumed by bitterness. Columbus spent his remaining 2 years in Spain, embroiled in ceaseless legal battles, fighting desperately to reclaim his lost titles, his percentage of the wealth. His legacy he sent letter after letter to the crown, filled with a mix of self-pity, righteous indignation, and unwavering belief in his divine mission, portraying himself as a forgotten hero, a martyr for God and Spain. But the monarchs, wary of his past abuses and perhaps weary of his relentless demands, refused to grant him full power. His claims were largely dismissed, his authority never truly restored. He died in Valladolid on May 20, 1506, a man who, despite having irrevocably altered the course of human history, believed he had failed. He died impoverished relative to his grand expectations, stripped of the honor he felt was his due, and convinced that he had fallen short of his true purpose, to find the true Orient, to open a direct route to Asia, and to fulfill his divine mandate. His measure of success was his own original goal, not the unforeseen, monumental consequence of discovering a new continent. He died believing he hadn't reached Asia, hadn't found the legendary spices, hadn't secured the vast riches that would fund a new crusade. He died believing his life's grand ambition was unfulfilled, that he had failed to truly complete the divine task he felt he was chosen for. The irony is stark, profound, and utterly tragic. A man who arguably achieved one of the greatest feats in human history, connecting two worlds, yet carried the crushing burden of perceived failure to his grave. His legacy, viewed through the lens of his own expectations, was a bitter testament to the power of grand delusions and the unforeseen, dark currents of history he unleashed. The halo of history often obscures the raw human cost, the personal torment, and the self-inflicted wounds of those who stand at its precipice. Christopher Columbus, the discoverer, was also a man haunted by his own unfulfilled promises, his final days shrouded in the profound personal tragedy of believing he had failed. His life, a monumental paradox. A man whose discovery reshaped the world, yet who died convinced he hadn't achieved his true goal. A testament to the power of unwavering belief and the tragic shadow of unfulfilled prophecy. This tale, like so many from the age of exploration, reminds us that history is often far more complex and far darker than the polished narratives we're fed. If you found this journey into the mind of Columbus as fascinating and unsettling as we did, please don't forget to subscribe to our channel, hit that like button, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Your support helps us uncover more of these hidden histories. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.